Don't tell me my husband erased me from his life after 42 years, Daniel. The words came out sharper than I meant them to, but I had spent 26 days swallowing grief, condolences, casseroles from neighbors, and everyone's careful little suggestions about what a 72-year-old widow should do next. That morning, I finally stopped swallowing. The letter from Heritage Mutual Life was still open on my kitchen table, beside Arthur's untouched coffee mug. I had read the sentence 6 times, hoping the words might rearrange themselves. They never did. My claim on Arthur's $1.2 million life insurance policy could not be processed because I was no longer listed as the beneficiary. Melissa Whitmore was. My daughter-in-law. Daniel stayed quiet on the phone long enough for me to hear the hum of his car engine. Then he said, "Mom, Dad had his reasons." Something inside me went cold. Not because of the money. Because my son already knew. "What reasons?" I asked. I think Melissa should explain it. That afternoon, they drove the 17 miles from their house and sat across from me in the living room Arthur had painted pale gray only 2 summers earlier. Daniel kept rubbing his wedding ring with his thumb. Melissa sat perfectly straight, one ankle crossed over the other, a leather folder resting on her knees. "Arthur was worried about you," she said gently. Too gently. He thought managing that kind of money might become overwhelming. I stared at her. Arthur had trusted me with every household bill, every tax return, every mortgage payment for 4 decades. Yet Melissa spoke as though 40 years of making decisions beside Arthur had disappeared the moment he did. Sitting there, listening to her describe me as someone who could no longer be trusted with my own future, I felt smaller than I had at any point since the funeral. "He wanted someone strong enough to handle things," she continued. Daniel looked at the carpet. That hurt more than anything Melissa said. Before leaving, she slid a photocopy across the coffee table. "You deserve to see the form yourself." I waited until their car disappeared down the street before touching it. Arthur's name appeared at the bottom in blue ink. Arthur Whitmore. I knew that signature better than I knew my own reflection. I had watched him sign birthday cards, bank papers, checks, school forms for Daniel, even the deed to this house. Yet something about this one made the room feel strangely smaller. The final curve of the W rose too neatly. The pause in the middle of the T looked familiar. Not familiar in the ordinary way. Familiar like a sentence I had already read. I carried the page into Arthur's den. His old wooden desk still smelled faintly of cedar and the peppermint candies he kept in the top drawer. As I opened it, the small brass clock on the bookshelf clicked once behind me. I turned. That clock had stopped the night Arthur died and had not moved since. The hand still pointed to 2:17. I told myself old clocks made noises. Houses settled. Grief made people notice foolish things. Then I found a property tax authorization from 4 years earlier. Arthur's signature sat near the bottom. I placed it beside the insurance form. My breath caught. The signatures were not just similar. The tiny hesitation in the first stroke was in exactly the same place. So was a faint break near the last letter. Even the upward tail ended at the same angle. I called Harold Bennett, Arthur's longtime attorney in Columbus, and sent him photographs of both pages. Harold did not speak for several seconds after opening them. "Evelyn," he finally said, "where did you get the insurance form?" "Melissa brought it." Another silence. Then I heard him exhale. "Do not give anyone the original documents in Arthur's desk." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Why?" Harold's voice dropped. "Because real signatures can resemble each other, but they almost never repeat themselves perfectly." At that exact moment, Arthur's dead brass clock clicked again behind me, and when I turned toward it, the minute hand was no longer pointing to 2:17. I stared at the brass clock until my eyes began to ache. The minute hand rested at 2:18 now. 1 minute forward. Nothing else in the room had changed. I reached for it with both hands, lifted it from the shelf, and turned the winding key. It was already tight. Arthur used to wind that clock every Sunday evening after dinner, always saying a house needed at least one thing that refused to depend on electricity. I set it back down and told myself there had to be a mechanical explanation. Harold was still on the phone. "Evelyn, are you there?" "Yes." I did not tell him about the clock. Not yet. He asked me to bring every insurance document I could find to his office the next morning. Columbus was just over 30 miles away, and I drove there with Arthur's papers locked inside an old canvas document case he had carried to tax appointments for years. Harold's office occupied the second floor of a brick building near Broad Street. He had represented our family since Daniel was in college, and when he saw me walk in, he did not offer the soft, pitying smile people had been giving me since Arthur's funeral. He simply pulled out a chair and said, "Show me everything." For nearly an hour, we compared signatures, checks, property records, a vehicle title, Arthur's will, the insurance form Melissa had brought me. Harold placed the 4-year-old property tax authorization beside the beneficiary page and used a magnifying lamp over both. "This is more than resemblance," he said. The same hesitation, the same ink break, even the slight flattening at the end. "So Melissa copied it?" I asked. Harold leaned back. "I'm saying we need evidence before we accuse anyone." That answer frustrated me, but I knew he was right. Then his assistant, Claire Dawson, knocked and entered with a printed email from Heritage Mutual. Harold had contacted their compliance department before I arrived. He read the first page twice. His expression changed. "What?" I asked. "Arthur requested a beneficiary change packet 6 weeks before he died." The room seemed to tilt. "No, the request came from his policy account. It was mailed to your home address." I felt my certainty crack straight down the middle. Melissa had lied about many things before, usually small enough to disguise as misunderstandings. But this was different. Arthur himself had asked for the form. Maybe Daniel had been telling the truth. Maybe my husband really had decided I was no longer capable of managing his money. On the drive home, I barely noticed the traffic. I kept hearing Arthur's voice in my memory, telling me where he had left the grocery receipt, reminding me to renew the homeowner's policy, asking whether I thought Daniel needed help with his mortgage. He had never treated me like someone fragile. When I stepped into the house, the den door was open. I was certain I had closed it that morning. The brass clock was ticking now, not loudly, just enough for me to hear it from the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. I walked toward it, feeling ridiculous for being afraid of a clock. The hands read 2:23. Beneath it, on Arthur's desk, one drawer stood open by 2 inches. Inside was a cream-colored envelope I had somehow missed. Before I could touch it, my phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the screen. "Evelyn," he said the moment I answered. "Heritage Mutual found something else in the archive." I gripped the edge of the desk. "What?" Harold paused. "There weren't one beneficiary form, Evelyn. There were two." "Two?" I asked, and even to my own ears, the word sounded thin. Harold told me Heritage Mutual had located an earlier version of Arthur's beneficiary paperwork in a temporary archive, but their compliance officer, Rachel Monroe, could not release it until the internal review was formally opened. What she could confirm was that the 2 documents did not match. Before I could ask how, the brass clock behind me stopped. The silence was so sudden that I turned toward it. The hands had frozen at 2:23. I looked down at the cream-colored envelope in Arthur's drawer, but Harold was still speaking. "There's another problem, Evelyn. Daniel's signature appears on the final form as a witness." My stomach tightened. He told me Arthur had his reasons. He never said he witnessed anything. Harold asked me not to confront Daniel until he checked the date. I ignored that advice for exactly 12 minutes. Daniel answered on the 4th ring. "Did you watch your father sign that insurance form?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "Yes." "Where?" "At your house." "When?" Another pause. "I don't remember exactly." "I did." The date printed beside Daniel's witness signature was October 14th. I kept a wall calendar in the kitchen because Arthur hated putting appointments into a phone. On October 14th, I had written one note in blue ink. Daniel, Indianapolis Conference. I could still remember Arthur complaining that Daniel had driven 187 miles for a 3-day sales meeting and forgotten to call when he arrived. When Harold later challenged Daniel about the date, Daniel reluctantly sent him the hotel receipt and conference registration from that trip. Both placed him in Indianapolis that evening. Daniel had not been sitting in our living room watching Arthur sign anything. He had lied directly to me. Melissa called before dinner. Her voice was controlled, almost irritated. "Evelyn, you're turning paperwork into a family war. Then tell Daniel to stop changing his story." Her voice went still. "Grief can make ordinary details feel suspicious." That sentence stayed with me long after she hung up. Around 9, I returned to Arthur's den and finally opened the cream envelope. It contained no letter, only an old photograph of Arthur and Daniel standing beside our first house. And on the back Arthur had written a date from nearly 30 years ago. Nothing about insurance. Nothing about Melissa. I almost laughed at myself for expecting a message from the dead. Then the brass clock clicked once. The hands moved from 2:23 to 2:24. A moment later, my phone rang. Daniel. He sounded different this time. Smaller. Mom, I need to correct something. I sat in Arthur's desk chair. You weren't there when he signed it. Daniel breathed out slowly. No, he admitted Melissa had brought him a page later and told him his signature only confirmed that Arthur had discussed changing the policy. He signed without reading the rest. Why would you do that? I asked. Because she said Dad wanted it handled privately. I closed my eyes. Then Daniel added something that made me sit upright. A few days before Arthur died, they had been alone in our garage when Arthur asked him a strange question. Daniel had laughed it off at the time. What question? I said. Daniel swallowed. Dad asked me, if somebody changed the page but kept the signature, would you notice? The clock behind me started ticking again, and for the first time, I wondered whether Arthur had known exactly what someone was planning. For the first time since Arthur died, I stopped asking whether the clock was trying to frighten me and started wondering whether I had misunderstood it. The next morning, Harold called before I finished my coffee. Rachel Monroe had released the earlier beneficiary form under Heritage Mutual's internal review. I drove the 30 miles to Columbus with Arthur's canvas document case on the passenger seat and the sound of Daniel's question repeating in my mind. If somebody changed the page but kept the signature, would you notice? Harold was waiting with 2 copies spread across his conference table. Look at the first one, he said. I expected to see Melissa's name somewhere. I did not. Under primary beneficiary, Arthur had written Evelyn Whitmore. Under contingent beneficiary, he had written Daniel Whitmore. I read the lines twice. So he was changing the policy. I said. Yes, Harold replied. But he wasn't removing you. The first form had been prepared 6 weeks before Arthur died. The second, submitted later, contained the same policy number, the same address, and much of the same typed information. But one page was different. On that page, Melissa's name replaced mine as primary beneficiary. Rachel had also found formatting inconsistencies in the digital file. The margins were slightly narrower. The footer sat nearly 1/8 of an inch higher. Someone had inserted a replacement page into a legitimate packet. And Arthur's signature? I asked. Harold tapped the bottom line. It appears to have been copied from an older document. I thought of the property tax authorization and that perfect upward curve. Suddenly, Melissa's confidence made more sense. She had not invented an entire insurance packet. She had hidden one altered page inside something Arthur had actually begun. That afternoon, I confronted Daniel in Harold's office. He looked pale when he saw the 2 forms side by side. I never saw that first one, he said. Harold asked who had access to Arthur's papers during his final weeks. Daniel shook his head. Mom. Dad. Maybe me. I said nothing. Then Daniel looked at me. Melissa was helping with paperwork. I remembered her sitting in Arthur's den on several afternoons, sorting medical statements into folders, telling me to rest while she handled the boring things. At the time, I had been grateful. Now I remembered one more detail. She had once asked where Arthur kept his insurance policy number because she claimed a hospital billing office needed it. The room seemed colder after I said that aloud. When I returned home, the brass clock was ticking steadily. I stood in the doorway of the den and watched it for nearly a minute. Then I noticed something I had never noticed before. Arthur had scratched 3 tiny pencil marks inside the wooden base beneath it. 17, 23, 24, the exact minutes the clock had stopped on since his death. I stared at those numbers, then at the drawers below his desk. The document folders inside were numbered. Folder 17 contained old tax records. Folder 23 held insurance correspondence. Folder 24 was nearly empty except for a receipt from Harold's office dated 11 days before the altered form was submitted. I called him immediately. Harold went silent when I read the date. Then I heard papers moving on his end. Evelyn, he said. Arthur came to see me that day. My grip tightened around the phone. About what? Harold answered slowly. I can't tell you yet. He left something here under specific instructions. What instructions? Another pause. He told me to open it only if someone ever tried to challenge your right to that insurance money. Harold opened Arthur's sealed envelope with Daniel and me sitting across from him. Rachel Monroe joined us by speakerphone from Heritage Mutual. My hands stayed flat on the conference table. I was afraid that if I moved them, everyone would see how badly they shook. Harold unfolded 3 pages. Arthur wrote this himself, he said. Then he began reading. Arthur had grown suspicious weeks before his death because Melissa kept asking questions about beneficiary rules. Whether a spouse had to be notified, whether a policy could be changed electronically, whether an original signature was required. Arthur had answered almost nothing. Instead, he requested a legitimate beneficiary change packet. My chest tightened. Harold kept reading. Arthur completed that packet privately. He left me as primary beneficiary. He changed only the contingent beneficiary to Daniel. Then he photocopied every page, every signature, every margin, every line. And 11 days before the altered form appeared, he brought those copies to Harold. Arthur had written one sentence beneath them. If another version is submitted, compare the pages. I stopped breathing for a moment. He knew. Not exactly what Melissa would do, but enough. Enough to leave a trail. Rachel spoke next. Her team had finished tracing the electronic submission. The altered form had been uploaded from the internet connection registered to Daniel and Melissa's house, 17 miles from mine. More importantly, the file metadata identified the user profile that had created the replacement page. The profile name was Melissa W. Daniel covered his face. I didn't upload it. Harold looked at him. But you signed the witness page. Daniel nodded. His voice cracked. Melissa told me Dad had already signed everything. She said she only needed me to confirm he'd discussed it. And you believed her? I asked. Daniel looked at me then, and I saw the answer before he spoke. I wanted to. Those 3 words hurt more than another lie would have. Rachel explained that the substituted page carried Arthur's copied signature from the 4-year-old property document. The digital artifacts matched. Same shape, same microscopic break, same old signature placed onto a new page. Melissa had not forged Arthur's entire insurance packet. She had altered the one page that mattered most. Then Daniel said something Harold had not expected. There's more. He admitted he had seen Melissa with Arthur's insurance folder before the final submission. He asked what she was doing. She told him Arthur had changed his mind and wanted the paperwork corrected. Daniel noticed a loose page beside her laptop. He noticed Dad's signature already printed at the bottom. And he walked away. You knew enough to question it, I said. Daniel lowered his eyes. Yes. Harold called Melissa from the conference room. She answered on speaker. At first she denied everything. Then Harold told her about Arthur's preserved copies. Rachel told her about the upload logs and the file metadata tied to Melissa's user profile. Daniel finally spoke. Melissa, stop. Silence. Long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the office air conditioner. Then Melissa said, You signed too, Daniel. I didn't know what you were submitting. Her voice sharpened. You saw me replace that page. You knew enough to stop me. Nobody answered. She seemed to realize what she had just admitted only after the words were already out. When I returned home after dark, Arthur's brass clock was silent again. The hands had stopped at 2:24. I opened folder 24 once more and found the Harold receipt. This time, something slipped from behind it. A narrow strip of paper in Arthur's handwriting. Only 4 words were written there. Turn the clock over. I did. Taped beneath the wooden base was a tiny brass key. I held the brass key under the kitchen light for nearly a minute before I understood what had opened. Arthur's clock had a narrow keyhole beneath the base, hidden behind a felt pad I had never thought to lift. My fingers barely worked as I turned the key. A small wooden panel released with a soft click. Inside was a folded note, a tiny watchmaker's tool, and one final insurance document. Arthur had written my name across the front of the note. Evelyn. Just Evelyn. I sat in his chair before opening it. His handwriting was uneven, but unmistakably his. He explained the clock first. Months earlier, its movement had begun catching at the same 3-minute marks, 17, 23, and 24. A watchmaker had told him a worn gear and sticky escapement could make an old clock stop and start again while the spring remained wound. Arthur had scratched those numbers beneath the base while trying to repair it. Then, because he was Arthur, he turned the flaw into something useful. He deliberately numbered 3 document folders 17, 23, and 24 and placed the papers he wanted protected inside them. The clock could not choose when to move. Arthur could not have known that it would click at the exact moments I was frightened or searching for answers. That part had been chance, but the numbers were not. He had built a trail out of a broken thing and trusted that, if I ever needed it badly enough, I would notice. I should have felt disappointed that there was an ordinary explanation. Instead, I began to cry. Not because something supernatural had vanished, but because the truth was somehow more like Arthur. Ordinary things, careful habits, small details left behind. His note continued. He wrote that he had become uneasy about Melissa's questions and did not want to accuse anyone without proof. So he preserved his insurance paperwork with Harold and placed one additional copy inside the clock compartment. It showed me as primary beneficiary and Daniel as contingent beneficiary. Beneath my name, Arthur had written a sentence in black fountain pen. Evie always comes first. Heritage Mutual formally rejected the altered beneficiary designation 2 weeks later. The $1.2 million policy was restored according to Arthur's valid instructions. Harold told me the disputed submission had been referred through the proper legal channels. I did not ask for every detail. By then, I understood that winning was not the same as healing. Daniel came to my house alone one Sunday afternoon. He apologized without excuses this time. I told him I loved him. I also told him love did not erase what he had allowed. If he wanted my trust again, he would have to earn it slowly. He nodded. For once, he did not ask me to make things easier for him. Melissa did not return to my home. I changed the locks anyway. I moved every financial document into a secure box at Harold's office and kept control of my accounts myself. The following afternoon, I took Arthur's clock to a local watchmaker. He cleaned the escapement, replaced the worn gear, and told me there was nothing mysterious about the way it had been stopping and starting. That evening, I wound it and sat alone in Arthur's chair. The hands passed 2:17, then 2:23, then 2:24. No pause this time. No secret movement. Just an old clock finally working the way it was meant to, measuring an ordinary evening in a house that was still mine. I placed Arthur's fountain pen beside it and touched the edge of his note. The clock had never been haunted. I knew that now. But grief had made every click sound like a question, and Arthur's careful habits had turned an ordinary mechanical flaw into the path that brought me to the truth. I rested my hand on his fountain pen and looked at his empty chair across from mine. The silence no longer felt like something pressing against me. It felt peaceful. Arthur had protected my name on paper while he was alive. After he was gone, I finally learned that protecting my voice was something only I could do.